in an atom, the ones that are furthest away have the most potential energy. It's kind of logical. And so you can see it here. Here's the nucleus. And so if I were to animate this and say, all right, here's an electron right there. And so if I were to take it up further, in other words, increase the potential energy, I would have to have energy to do that. I'm climbing up. And then when it falls back down, it releases. And so this is giving it potential energy, and this is releasing kinetic energy. And so potential energy, of course, equals kinetic energy. This is the first law of thermodynamics. And so, boy, it seems somewhat obvious or trivial. I mean, maybe in your inorganic chemistry class, you're familiar with the fact that you could take salt and put it under a Bunsen burner and heat it, which applies the energy, like in a flame test. And then when the electrons fall back down, they fluoresce in different colors, and you can use it to identify what some of the elements are in salt. What's very cool is, at the most fundamental level, can't get into it right now, but I will later in a separate video, is that an atom of magnesium in the center of a chlorophyll molecule, which is a green pigment, sunlight comes down and strikes the electrons of chlorophyll and raises the electrons up, but instead of them just fluorescing and falling back down, those electrons are then shared by other molecules. They're taken away, rather, in a redox reaction. Losing electrons is oxidation, and the compounds that are gaining it are become reduced, and ultimately that's how photosynthetic organisms can take electrons away from chlorophyll, because the sunlight is pushing them up, and that's why glucose has energy. So it's a little abstract. I'll come back to it later. I don't want to leave you hanging, but it's cool. And so light has the power of doing this. And so if you're following this, you might have this question. Well, if magnesium keeps losing electrons to glucose, then light is going to run out. It would. Water replaces the electrons. And then in so doing, it becomes oxygen. So the truth is, water is the ultimate source of energy. Not the sun. The sun's a catalyst. It's very important. It doesn't have to be that. So chemical behavior of an atom is mostly determined by the electrons. Not only the electrons, but their configuration. That is a term that you probably are familiar with. In other words, their distribution, of electrons within these shells. So as it turns out, since we're not going to consider all 92 naturally occurring elements, we always look at sort of the first 18. These are the ones that are found in life. Remember, there's 25 elements in life approximately. So we're basically in the 8 columns, but the first 3 rows. And so we have 3 energy shells that we contend with in biology. And so when we look at this, let me just show you a picture of this. So this is our sort of biological periodic table. It's reduced. And so the first shell is the first energy shell. So these electrons are not very far. These are a little bit farther up and a little bit farther up still. Okay, so these energy shells are not the exact location of the electrons. They're just showing the distance. And so as it turns out, 2 of them can occupy the first shell, and 8 can occupy the second shell. And you can see here, there's 1 electron in hydrogen, there's 2 over here, and there's 3 here, and there's 4 here. It corresponds to the atomic number. There's 6 electrons here in carbon. Where we're going to transition is, you might recall something called the Lewis dot structure. Like, for example, carbon, you can sort of take a shortcut, and you're like, well, I know it has 6 protons. I know it has 6 electrons. And I know that 2 of them are in the first shell, and 4 are in the outer shell. But it's the outer shell electrons, or that configuration, that gives carbon its unique property. What I mean by that is how it associates with other elements in terms of chemical bonding. So we could say that carbon, if I were to draw carbon, I could just symbolize it with doing 4 dots like this. This would be the Lewis dot structure. And hydrogen would be this. And nitrogen would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm just looking at outer electrons because those confer the property. And if you may recall, outer shell electrons are called valence electrons, or valence shell electrons. And so elements that have the same number of valence, in other words, nitrogen and phosphorus, behave similarly. Oxygen and sulfur behave similarly. So oxygen is more like sulfur than it is like nitrogen or fluorine. Fluorine is more like chlorine than it is like neon. Now, helium, neon, and argon are very unique because their outer shell electron is full, so those don't actually participate at all in chemical bonding. They're inert, or if you will, if you recall this from chemistry, they're noble. So these gases are noble gases because they don't participate in chemical bonding because their valence shell electron is complete. And so all the other ones attempt to complete their valence shell electron by either losing electrons or gaining electrons. And so when you actually talk about the specific location of an electron, it gets to be rather philosophical and abstract and statistical in terms of they're moving around very quickly in a 3-dimensional space, and so it's really hard to get a grip on it. When we talk about shells, we talk about discrete distances from the nucleus. So we use this term orbital to define where we believe the electrons are most often found. And so, as it turns out, the first shell has room for 1 spherical orbital, so that's a circle or a ball, a small ball around the nucleus. The second shell can occupy a larger sphere. Sometimes it's called a 2s for sphere. And then it can also occupy 3 p orbitals, which are dumbbell-shaped. And so this is what we have here. We have the first shell has a small s orbital, or cloud, and then the 2s is a larger one, and then the p has 3. It has a x on the horizontal, y on the vertical, and z coming at you. So there's 3 p orbitals. And so what we say about this is that when electrons, they're all negatively charged. And so one thing for certain about an electron, and they're moving really fast, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to electrons, don't worry. But one thing that we can be very certain is that, for example, let me take this s orbital and make it a little bit larger, like this. we could say that if one is moving in an up direction,